بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Gotta be right up here. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد. So, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, we're here tonight, despite the cold. It's kind of hard to get out of the house when it's this cold, but, that's very commendable, alhamdulillah. So last week we had begun with the class, and we began with the first hadith, known as the hadith of revelation, or the beginning of revelation, hadith Bad al-Wahi. And we have gotten through some of it. It is the longest hadith I think we're going to cover, so that's why it might take us to finish up this week with it tonight, inshallah. And just a brief summary. We said that the Prophet ﷺ, this particular hadith is narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, who actually wasn't there at the time, wasn't even born yet. But this is something the Prophet ﷺ related to her later, indicating that it's an important event and that it's something that should be preserved for posterity. And you'll find many of the traditions that come through Sayyidah Aisha oftentimes have not been narrated by other companions. And she had sort of like a type of access to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, being his wife, that many of the other Sahaba may not have had. So this theme in this hadith, we see one, the narrator of the hadith is Aisha radiallahu anha, and then the main woman in the hadith is the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidah Khadija. And this is the first hadith in the book that Ibn Abi Jamrah chose from the Sahih al-Bukhari. So I think it's poignant that we see these two particular women, radiallahu anhum. Without them, we would have not known how this actually all started with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These were two particular women. And so it's very important that we understand that this Islamic tradition, this deen, this risala, this mission has been transmitted to us by the most pious men and women who ever lived. And so if someone wants to embody the risala, this particular risala Muhammadiyya, ala sahibha afdal salatu wassalam, then they too should embody this piety, this penitence, this level of tadarru' and returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, Allah make us from those who exhibit that. And we mentioned last week that prior to the occasion of Ghar Hira, that the Prophet ﷺ did have what we call irhasat in Arabic, which means, for lack of a better word, premonitions that were indicative that later on he would become a prophet. And of course he was aware of them. He knew that the rocks and the inanimate things would give him salam as he walked by. He saw the ghamama that followed him, the cloud that followed him. He went with his uncle to Syria, Sham, Bilad al-Sham, and he was there when the Bukhari al-Rahib mentioned to him that your nephew here exhibits all of the signs of prophecy. Hasten quickly back to Mecca, otherwise there might be people who might hurt him. So he was privy to all of this that was happening. So he had some idea, but as we can see in his reaction to Jibreel alayhi salam, it was not something that he had absolute certainty about at the time. And so like many of the Hunafa, and we said the Hanif is the one who tried to find the true deen of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So I've never seen the Prophet ﷺ being described as Hanif, because we know that he has a special status and that he is protected from error and sin and is infallible from both before prophecy and afterwards. But he did do or adopt some of the practices that they did, such as this type of seclusion. So he did seclude himself, as we see from the hadith, on many occasions from the foolery and the triviality of Meccan society at the time, which was one of the few settlements in the whole Arabian Peninsula. As we mentioned last week, most of the Arabian Peninsula was nomadic Bedouin tribes who were constantly on the move because they had to find water, number one, and they had to find al-kala, or the area where their animals could graze. And so this dictated that they had to be traveling a lot and moving from one place to the next. But Mecca was different. Mecca made its fortune by way more or less of the annual pilgrimage, the Hajj, and they were established traders going as far as Syria and Yemen, north and south, to trade even with other civilizations, even non-Arabs. So I think we left off when the Archangel Jibreel alayhi salam came to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and said, "Iqra," read or recite. And then he responded back, "Ma ana biqari," that he is unlettered, that he did not know how to read or recite. And in those days, reading and recitation were more or less synonymous, and it was known that even being learned is kind of also a synonym for reading or recitation. When the Prophet ﷺ said, يَأُمُّ الصَّلَاةَ أَقْرَأَكُمْ لِلْقُرْآنِ, right? The one who should lead the prayer is أَقْرَأَكُمْ, which means the most well-read. It didn't necessarily mean the one who has the best recitation of the Quran, as many people might think, but rather the one who is most versed in understanding the Quran. In other words, the most well-versed in understanding the religion to begin with, not the one with the most beautiful recitation. That's why the fuqaha, they said the one who has the most right to lead the prayer is the one who has the best knowledge of the ahkam, of the legal rulings of the prayer itself. But in those days, that was synonymous with someone who had an understanding of the Quran itself. So there wasn't this kind of divergence between readers and reciters of the Quran. Like today we say, oh, fulan qari. We say he's a qari, which means that, he reads the Quran, but he's not really alim, or he's not sheikh, or he's not that learned. And so we have many, many people memorizing the Quran and reciting the Quran quite beautifully, which is a good thing, which is a beautiful thing. But at the same time, many of those people don't really know what they're reciting and what they're actually saying, and what the meanings that they're saying. And Ibn Mas'ud, I think, has a khabar, an athar, where he said that the Sahaba lived in a time where it was قليل القراء وكثير الفقهاء, that those who have a well-established understanding of the deen are many, and those who are just merely reciters are few. And then there will come a time, كثير القراء قليل الفقهاء, where there will be many reciters, merely reciters, and then there will be few fuqaha. There will be few who actually have a grasp and a strong understanding of what it is they're reciting. And this has been upon us for quite some time now. Not to take away from people who have memorized the Quran or recited beautifully. That is it's matlub, it's something that we have to do. And whether one reads the Quran with understanding, without understanding, they are rewarded, وَمَأْجُورُونَ, as the hadith has come. But at the same time, the Quran was not meant just to be recited for purely recitation. Yes, we are مُتَعَبِّلُونَ بِتِلَاوَتِهِ, that we take it as a devotional act to its tilawa, to recite it, but not merely for recitation. And even that word tilawa, by the way, is specific to more or less the Quran. We don't really say talawtul hadith or talawtul kitab. We say talawtul Quran. So tilawa means reciting something, whether from memory or from actual pages of the book, but with the intention that the actual recitation of itself is a ibadah. is an act of worship. Whereas when we say qara'tu, qara'tu doesn't just mean you've read it, it means you've read it and you understood it. You've imbibed it. So you wouldn't say qara'tu al-kitab, you wouldn't say I've read the book, unless you've really read the book. And qira'ah also has this meaning of not just silent reading by yourself. That would be closer to tilawa, if it was an act of worship, or what they call mutala'a. Mutala'a means that you've looked through the book by yourself. Amma qira'ah, people didn't used to say qara'tu al-kitab or qara'tu hadha al-kitab unless they've actually read it and understood it, and that means they read it with someone who understood it themselves, and then they got that understanding. So that means they were taught the book, right? Like they say, they don't use this too much here in the US, but in the UK they'll say, I read for this degree. I read for law, or I read for history, or I read for something. I don't think they say that here. But in the UK it has that meaning, like I've read for the thing means not I've just kind of sifted through it like my Facebook status update, but rather I've read it and fully imbibed and understood it. That qira'ah. So when Jibreel alayhi salam said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, iqra', right, it means from what you have learned and to recite and to read, all of those meanings come alive. And then that's when the Prophet ﷺ says, مَا أَنَا بِقَارِئ, I am not one who is lettered and learned in the sense that the Prophet ﷺ understood from him. One may ask the question, well, obviously, didn't Jibreel know that the Prophet ﷺ was going to answer that, or he wasn't being able to give him the response he was looking for? Of course he did, right? Because he's sent from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Huwa Rasulullah to Rasulillah. He is the messenger of God, Jibreel, to the messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he knew that. So why did he ask? Herein lies a very important point. And we see it also in what he did after. So he said, مَا أَنَا بِقَارِئ, I am not someone who reads or recites. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, فَأَخَذَنِي فَغَطَّنِي حَتَّى بَلَغَ مِنِّي الْجَهْدِ. So he took me, فَغَطَّنِي, grabbed me, and it also means to bring him close to him, until بَلَغَ مِنِّي الْجَهْدِ means until I was exerted in such a way that I was, completely exhausted after he did that. And then he asked again, then a second time and a third time. So 3 times this happened. So one question is, why did he ask if he knew what the answer would be? And number 2, let's suppose he didn't know what the answer would be, why did he have to do it a second and then a third time? So Ibn Abi Jamrah, he has an interesting thesis here. He says the reason he did that is, this is showing us the idea that we had mentioned as a last point last week, the idea of ta'deeb and tarbiyah. Ta'deeb, tarbiyah, similar words. And then the third T, taraqqi. Ta'deeb, tarbiyah, and taraqqi. So ta'deeb is not really a very good English translation for it. Because the word adab, if you look it up, it means etiquette. It can also mean Bell's letters, which is like high literary form and style. So when someone said, I've read adab or I've studied adab, it means that I've studied sort of the literary tradition. So I've studied al-Jahid and al-Mubarrid and what Ibn Khaldun wrote, and so you have some idea of that high literary tradition. And there used to be the person who would train in pre-modern Islamic societies, the person who would train the children of the household. Like like Sound of Music, they call her governess. Remember that? The governess. Don't you have a governess? Pride and Prejudice too, right? She asked her, do you have a governess? She said, oh no, governess. So the governess, or the mu'addib, is the person who trains the young people in the house. Their teacher. You didn't have like classroom, that's something that came with Dewey and later on. But before, you had tutors. So the tutor was often referred to as the mu'addib, the one who would teach the child or the student adab. In other words, to actually ingrain them and make them come out with their good character and their very human-like attributes. And it was understood that that can be cultivated. It's a type of cultivation, and it takes time, and it's done through reading, through understanding the ideas of people who came before them. So to be initiated into that whole understanding of benefiting from others' thoughts, which come in the form of books, that was a type of adab they were referring to. So someone who has adab, in the sort of Arab vernacular today, it means someone who has a little bit of class, someone who's well-mannered, behaved. But that idea of well-mannered, behaved comes back from the idea that one is cultured, one has been cultivated, one has been trained in the finer arts, so forth. And we mentioned the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Addabani Rabbi fa ahsana ta'dibi." That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one who is my mu'addib. He is the one who trained me, and He gave me the best type of ta'deeb, of training or discipline. And this is a marked contrast, in my opinion, to kind of the idea behind Islamic education versus Western education. If you read the classic philosophers' education in the Western canon, they talk about autonomy, and that it's very important that the child has this idea of autonomy. And autonomy means they're an autonomous individual, and they are not beleaguered or burdened by tradition of inherited tradition from their parents or from whoever, and that they can be creative thinkers and make decisions by themselves without falling back on the tradition of those who came before them. Whereas in our paradigm, the whole idea is adab, ta'deeb. And many of our scholars, they said one of the main issues we have today with the ummah is there's a lack of adab. That we've lost this idea of ta'deeb, of disciplining and training and cultivating. So to me, there's obviously a marked contrast between the two. Does not mean that Islam says there's no autonomy. Doesn't mean that we say, it's always fall back on your traditions, don't think for yourself. Rather, for one to actually graduate to that level of critical thinking, there has to be a basis by which they can embark first. Much as the great scholar Ahmad Zarruq, he said, قِفْ حَيْثُ وَقَفُوا ثُمَّ سِرْ. Stand where they stood and then proceed. Or when Newton said, I stand on the shoulder of giants. Same meaning. To completely understand the canon, the tradition that came before you, and then proceed. But outright dismissal of all of that and saying that it's burdensome and that it puts people in a position where they can't make their decisions or be critical thinkers, I think that's something that we'd have to disagree with, at least my point of view. And our deen is the deen of Iqra. It's the deen of reading and recitation, understanding and knowledge. It's definitely a knowledge-based paradigm. Everything is based upon knowledge. So the 3 times that Jibreel alayhi salam was asking the question, knowing what the answer would be, and nevertheless having the same reaction, grabbing the Prophet ﷺ, until he was completely exhausted. This was a type of ta'deeb or tarbiyah. Tarbiyah is a similar word from rabba yurabbi, which means, comes from the same word as rububiyyah or Rabb, which means Lord. And so it means to instill someone with traits that will kind of make them, in a sense, someone who has some of these aspects of rububiyyah, but in a human sense. Because we say Rabb, if we just say Rabb by itself, then we mean Allah, we mean Lord. But if we have an idafa, we qualify it with something. So we can say Rabb al-Bayt, Rabb al-Manzil, so the lord of the house or the lord of the place, then it's okay to be human in that sense. So it means someone who has sort of autonomy and sovereignty over a particular thing. For human beings, it's a limited sense. Whatever they have, the Rabb of the house or of the business or whatever it might be. Or for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's mutlaq. Mutlaq means unqualified, absolute. Human beings, it's qualified. So tarbiyah is also this meaning of training, discipline. They also use it for animals, right? I don't think they usually use the word ta'deeb for animals, but when you say tarbiyah, it can apply to training a horse, to ride a horse, or to a hunting dog and things like this. People used to train animals for good reasons, for a purpose. Now we train animals to do circus tricks and entertain people, which has no basis whatsoever in our tradition. You see that movie Blackfish with the killer whales, it shows you the ends that these societies will go to entertain ourselves, even at the detriment of human beings and animals at the same time. So the idea of training, and even the Quran says تُعَلِّمُوهُنْ مُكَلَّبِينَ تُعَلِّمُونَهُنْ. So the dogs that were trained as hunting dogs, and you train them or teach them, or they learn behavior, how to go after the quarry or the prey and bring it back. And it said if the hunting dog is trained, when you strike the quarry or the prey, it will go and bring it back without eating from it. That's how it's supposed to be trained, without biting into it and killing it or eating from it. So this tarbiyah applies both to both human beings and to animals. And then the last one we mentioned, taraqqi. Taraqqi actually means to ascend. And so in our understanding of ta'deeb and tarbiyah for human beings in particular, there's a type of ascendancy. So we think that someone who is mu'addab or murabba or has gone through this type of training, they started at a particular point and then they're ascending to a higher point. Not physically, but spiritually. So spiritually ascendancy is something you can draw very easily from this hadith. Okay, so that answers the question why he did it, and he knew the answer. What about 3 times? What about 3? 3 is significant as well. And the Prophet ﷺ, in his style, even as a teacher, oftentimes he would mention something 3 times. Like when, or he would let people ask the question 3 times. Someone asked him about Hajj, أَكُلِّ عَامٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ? Should we make Hajj every year? And he didn't answer him back. Then he asked a second time, he didn't answer back. He asked a third time, and after the third time he said, لَو كُنْتُ نَعَمْ لَوَجَبَتْ. Had I said yes, then it would have been something we'd all have to do, and you cannot. وَلَا تُطِيقُونَ. And it's outside your ability. When the man asked him, أَوْصِنِي, give me advice. And the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تغضب. And then he said, أوصني once again, لا تغضب. And then the third time, the same answer. He said, don't become angry. So when he said, give me advice, don't become angry, and the question was asked 3 times, and the Prophet ﷺ answered 3 times. So you could say in the spiritual pedagogy of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or his style of teaching, that 3 was significant, and it's significant here. And some of them said that the first time that you hear something, it kind of grabs your attention, but may not necessarily penetrate your understanding. You might have to say, what was that you said? You heard what they said, but you want to hear it again because it grabbed your attention, but you're not sure exactly what it was or how it was to be meant. Then the second time, it's beyond grabbing your attention. The second time, you start to understand what it is. Now you've understood what it was. Then the third time, it's contemplating what it is. Not just understanding, but thinking about, well, how do I apply this? How do I put this in my life? How do I go about this? So the 3 times is significant. So after the 3rd time, he let him go. ثم أرسلني فقال, and then he gave him the first wahi. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم. So here maybe is another question. Why didn't he just give him the wahi from the beginning? Right? He could have just grabbed him or said to him, you know, like when Jibril went to Maryam alayhi salam, and he also appeared in the form of a man just like this, and then she saw him in her chamber and didn't know how he got there, and she said, إني أعوذ بك الرحمن إن كنت تقيا. Then he said to her immediately, قال إنما أنا رسول ربك لأهب لك غلاما زكيا. Immediately he said, I am a messenger from your Lord, and I'm here to give you the news of this baby that you will have, this son. He didn't do that with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He did this 3 times, and then he gave him the wahi, and then he gave him the first Quran. There's also a tarbiyah concept in here, a ta'deeb concept in here. The ulama have talked about it, and it's a duality that they call a binary, at-takhliya wa at-tahliya. Takhliya means emptying out, and tahliya means embodying, bringing in. So it means takhliya, ta, kha, lam, ya, ta marbuta, and tahliya, same word, but substitute the kha for the ha for the kha. Takhliya comes from al-khulu, khala, same words, emptiness, to empty out, to remove. And so this goes back to the sort of the nature of man, of the human being, and that they have a spiritual side and they have a physical side. And part of becoming more in tune with your spiritual side is not to let your physical side get in the way of that. And the physical side can get in the way of that when it's satiated, when it's given what it desires, whether it be in terms of food or carnal desires, or even things that like leadership and status, prestige. These are all things that are kind of slows one down, or impedes a little bit one being in contact with their more spiritual side. And so one can do all the sadaqah they want, one can pray all they want, but if they're doing a lot of haram at the same time, or makruh, their prayer is not going to really work for them, nor is their sadaqat, nor is their zakat, nor is their hajj, nor is their umrah. So takhliya is more about what you don't do. So the haram side of things, straining yourself, leaving things, not doing things. And the tahliya is about doing the right things. So our deen is both. It's not just about doing the right things, it's also about avoiding the wrong things. And it's generally acknowledged that avoiding the wrong has a higher precedence than doing the right. مَا نَهِيتُكُمْ عَنْهُ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said. The Prophet said, what I have forbidden you to do, avoid it. And he didn't give any qualification here. He just said avoid it. Whereas when he said, وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا بِهِ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. But when he talked about what you're supposed to do that's right, he said, do as much as you can. So it was qualified, second part. So the tahliya, do the right things, was qualified. Amma takhliya, which is the emptying out, it's more absolute. And hence, it takes precedence over doing the right things. So the first part here, they refer to as the takhliya. When the Jibreel alayhi salam took the Prophet and grabbed him and brought his body next to his, it wasn't just a physical interaction, there was a spiritual one at work too, where there was a takhliya, there was an emptying out that was happening. in order to prepare the Prophet ﷺ for what was coming next, which was the tahliyah, which was the wahy, which was the Quran. People often ask, I read a lot of Quran, but it's not penetrating me. I'm not getting out of it. I get tired of it. I might get bored. It's not. Usually the problem is you are trying to do the tahliyah and you haven't really completed the tahliyah. You're trying to bring the sweetness in, but you haven't removed the bitter. You haven't taken enough time emptying out, being yourself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely humble, completely humiliated even, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before then you can receive the sweetness of those meanings, because they will not penetrate an arrogant heart. Yes?
Should we ask questions? Or?
If it's for clarification, it's fine with me.
So that concept though of tahliyah in this instance with the Prophet, what is being emptied out? I mean, is there a parallel between this and when his chest was open?
Good question. Question was, so what is being emptied out here with the Prophet ﷺ? Is there a parallel when he was a child, when shaqqa sadr, when his chest was, his heart was taken? And yes, it's the same thing, similar. What is being emptied out here? As we said, the Prophet ﷺ was sinless, and he didn't have lustful desires either, and like other human beings. But remember, this is an example for the ummah, for the community that's coming later. In the same hadith, which we'll go over in a little bit, hopefully tonight, we'll get through it, inshallah. So the beginning verses of Surah Al-Muddathir, right? وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرُ الرُّجْزَ فَهْجُرْ. Who's that talking to? It's addressing the Prophet ﷺ. So purify your clothes, and the ridges, which are it's a metaphor for the idols, leave them. Prophet ﷺ never worshipped them to begin with, so why is this verse addressing him in this way? Same answer. This whole experience, right, with the evidence that Aisha is the one who's narrating it, not someone who's actually there, who was there at the time or alive at the time, gives us the idea that this experience is for the ummah, for us to take lessons in. And the Prophet ﷺ did have his own type of taraqqi as well. He did have his own type of spiritual ascendancy. But his starting point is already higher than what any of us could ever aspire to. His starting point was already higher than the highest point that any human being has ever reached, Siddiqiyya, namely that of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. It's acknowledged that the highest for a human being other than a prophet was the Siddiqiyya, to reach the maqam, the status of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, which would have still been lower than this when he started here in the cave of Hira. So nubuwwah, right, prophecy, prophethood cannot be aspired to. Allah chooses people for that. But something less than that, so there is a parallel type of ladder system, if you will, for people who are not prophets, but it follows this in concept and meaning, if not in letter. We have a few minutes, right, till Aisha? So then the wahy came after the Prophet ﷺ was muhayya, before he was made ready to receive that revelation. What's the lesson in that for us? The lesson in that for us is that we too have to be prepared. Right? Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ فِي أَيَّامِ دَهْرِكُمْ لَنَفَحَاتٍ أَلَا فَتَعْرَضُوا لَهَا. That you'll find in your days, there are nafahat, there are these spiritual breezes that come in the form of inspiration. So avail yourself of those spiritual breezes as they come. And the way that one avails themselves is to be spiritually prepared to receive them. And the way to spiritually prepare to receive them is you do as the Prophet ﷺ did here. Remember, he began with the seclusion in Ghar Hira, which was something he did. It was kind of an initiative he took. He went and he did this sort of detachment, at least on a physical level to lead to a spiritual detachment from the dunya. And then Allah ennobled him and gave him a spiritual takhliyah, a stronger one that came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, namely in the form of Jibreel coming to him and grabbing him, which was not the initiative of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that means for us, if we avail ourselves, we take the initiative, we take a step, like in the Hadith al-Qudsi, you take a step to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and He will come running to you, then some of this fayadanat, some of this these spiritual downpours that have come to people may come to us. And we'll stop here inshallah for the prayer.
Allah